And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Justine Damond. She is an amazing teacher, a student of Dr. Joe Dispenza, and now partnering with Dr. Joe Dispenza on a national project. So we are delighted that she is here to share with us some wonderful information about empowering and wonderful messages. Justine Damond, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Jay. I am in love with you, but my fiance knows, so that's fun. He is, and yeah, we'll talk about that later. Good morning. In Australia, we have a tradition that anytime we gather in a beautiful space like this to share wisdom and to share knowledge and just be together, we have what's called, the Indigenous population have what's called a welcome to country. If you're not a member of that local Indigenous population, we call it an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge, before we even begin today, the traditional custodians of this land, the Dakota Sioux and the Chippewa tribes, to thank them for holding space here. I'd also like to acknowledge the current custodians, Lake Harriet Spiritual Community, Gary, Nancy, who does so much here, Jay and the community, and all the volunteers. If this space wasn't here, we wouldn't be able to commune here and be able to spend Sunday morning. So thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge all of you guys, because if you didn't show up, I'd be hanging out here with crickets and tumbleweeds. So I want to start today with a couple of stories. When I began to look at all of this stuff, this potential that our mind has some interaction with our physical body and our reality outside, I came across some really curious stories. There was a man in Russia who worked on these freezer trains, these cargo trains that would take food across Russia. And he worked on them for decades. And he always told his family that he was terrified that one day he would accidentally get locked in and freeze to death in one of these trains, in one of these cargo lots. And sure enough, a few years later, they found him, locked inside an empty freezer cart. And on post-mortem, he'd frozen to death. His greatest fear had manifested. The curiosity was, when they checked the freezer cart, it wasn't on. The temperature had not dropped below freezing, and yet biologically, his body had frozen to death. When I began to look at all of this stuff, I was driven out of fear because my mother had died of cancer. There was alcoholism and depression. Cancer riddled through my family, and at that time, I'm going to age myself here, there was no internet. I would read stories, and they all said it was genetic. They all said it was inherited, and that I was doomed to a genetic destiny. When I started reading about this stuff and trying to find stories of hope, I would read stories of people that were diagnosed with the same disease process, for example, pancreatic cancer. Their doctors at the time had given them both 6 months to live, and one would die 6 months to the day of diagnosis, and the other, though, would recover and never have cancer in their body again. So each one of these stories piqued my curiosity, and each one of these stories invited me to move out of fear into fascination, to try to find out what these miracle stories were. And I see a lot of familiar faces. Thank you for coming back to hang out again. And so you know that I like to hang out where things get weird. In Australia, I use a different word for things. Usually starts with S and ends with T. We like to hang out where things get weird, where things are getting down the rabbit hole and everything's curiouser and curiouser and curiouser. So after I lost my mother and I was terrified, I began to read as much as I could, and I wanted miracles to become the norm in my life. I wanted to fall in love with these extraordinary stories, but I'm also a nerd by nature, so I'm a veterinary surgeon by training. So even though I was studying yoga and practicing meditation and diving down that rabbit hole and having experiences of different states of consciousness, it wasn't enough for me to have blind faith in it. I wanted to understand how and why. So in 2006, I saw a movie called What the Bleep Do We Know? Put your hand up if you've seen that. Got lots of head. Good. So a lot of you are probably familiar with this amazing man called Dr. Joe Dispenza. Have you guys heard of him, Dr. Joe? Has anyone been to his workshops? A couple of people? Yeah. I recommend you dive into it. Unfortunately, he's actually not in the States as much as he used to be. He's traveling so much to South America and Mexico and to Europe and teaching over there. So grab him while you can. The next workshop, I believe, is in August in Toronto. But Dr. Joe Dispenza has a fascinating story. He was an A-type personality, so very, very productive, shall we say. He was already practicing as a hypnotherapist. He was a chiropractor who was practicing. He was a yogi, and he was training because he had so much extra time on his hands to go into a triathlon. And he had trained really hard. He was super excited about it, and he was in the triathlon, cycling down the road and turning a corner, and the policeman who was managing the traffic was waving him through. So he, on his bike, turned the corner. Who didn't notice the policeman was a little old lady in an SUV. And she drove straight towards him and hit him front on his bike. His bike flew away, he flew through the air, and he landed on the ground, seated, so that his spine compressed and shattered as he landed. This happened about 25, 30 years ago. Dr. Joe was sitting there, and the little lady had not noticed what had happened and was still driving towards him. And so he grabbed onto the bumper of this SUV and was dragged backwards across the gravel road until she finally stopped and he rolled away and laid there. He could feel the blood pooling around his spine, and he thought, this isn't good. He had knowledge of all the way the body worked with his chiropractic training, with his hypnotherapy, with his yoga teachings, and he knew this wasn't good. Sure enough, on X-ray he saw that most of his spine had shattered into a lot of fragmented pieces, and there were displaced fragments. If you know anything about bone healing, you really need to get those pieces of bone to line up near each other so they set up a little conversation and begin to heal. You also need to then start to increase the weight so they start to grow back together, and it's a very intricate process. But if you have a shattered spine, you have two problems there. One, there's no support, and the second is if you move while those pieces are fragmented, they might slip around and actually sever your spinal cord. So Joe was in bed, in the hospital bed. He had 4 doctors from around America give him the same treatment suggestion, and that was to fuse a titanium rod to his spine, 12 inches. They said, you might walk in about a year. Probably never without pain. You're not really going to have very much mobility with a titanium rod fused to your spine. And something in Dr. Joe didn't sit right with that decision. He had himself taken out of the hospital and discharged. He had himself taken to his friend's attic where he decided on his own healing process. He already had a lot of information. He already knew a lot about the way the bone heals and the body heals. But intuitively, he felt that there was a greater intelligence in his body, and if he could just get in contact with that intelligence, if he could take his attention away from the external environment long enough to enter into conversation with an extraordinary intelligence that knows how to heal, but just requires one thing: your attention. Your presence, your attention, and your decision on what you choose for yourself. 1 year, they had said to Dr. Joe, you may walk if you have this surgery. With his own healing regime, Dr. Joe Dispenza went back to seeing clients in his chiropractic clinic 10 weeks later. No surgery, no intervention. His spine had healed. Pretty spectacular stuff, right? And this might be someone you want to start to listen to and pay attention to if you're in my situation, that was facing a very specific future timeline, that was being told I was going to have cancer, depression, alcoholism, maybe all 3 of them if I was doomed to my genetic future. So I read this guy's book, Evolve Your Brain, his first book, which was birthed out of his desire to share what he had learned. And when you start to find out about these things that we call spontaneous remissions or instantaneous healings, what you find is, and this is what Dr. Joe did with his, do I have my little pointer? There it is. With his first book, Evolve Your Brain, was he went and he interviewed a lot of people who had had these spontaneous remissions, and you'll find that a lot of them, when they enter into conversation with this greater power, they make this promise: please, if you work with me to help me heal my body or help me heal my life, I promise you I'll commit, and I will work with you to share this information with as many people as I can. So the first book is pretty intense. It's a lot of science. And over the years, when I started working with Dr. Joe, we would have about 100 people in the room, and he would be teaching this biological model for change. So he became fascinated by the new discoveries in neuroscience that were happening. And what would happen was we would have about 100 people in the room. 98 of them would be women. There'd usually be 2 men. And a lot of the women, or a lot of the people there, were there because of trauma, were there because something had happened in their life, either a diagnosis, a relationship breakdown, something like that. So people were coming out of last desperate attempts for change. Over the years now, we have 500 to 600 people showing up to meditate together. In the beginning, it was people who were coming through trauma. Now we have people curious and curiouser and curiouser about what's happening in these meditations. Because initially, people were learning the biological model for change, taking that home, practicing it, changing their own state of health and wellness sometime later. In around 2011, things began to change when during meditations, people's states of health would transform in 45 minutes to an hour. Myself, my fiancé Don, we've all been there. My mother-in-law, he's sitting up the back here. We've seen these people who arrive at these meditations with a brain tumour and 3 days later walk out with no brain tumour. They sit down in a meditation with a leg that's been damaged by multiple sclerosis and they've had no feeling in it for 20 years. And this woman stood up after one meditation and ran across the room. A woman who'd had breast cancer, and because of that breast cancer, the doctors had removed her lymph nodes. But they didn't tell her, yes, you might not die of cancer, but because we've taken the lymphatic system out of your body, you're not going to be able to drain the toxins, and you're probably going to die from an infection within the next few years. They didn't tell her that until the infections began to roll over again and again. She was put on the strongest antibiotics you could possibly have from the government, and her skin was not healing. She began to come to these workshops. She stopped taking the antibiotics. She didn't regrow her lymph nodes. They couldn't measure that, but her system recalibrated itself to health because she was given permission to think that there's something more extraordinary in the body going on. Does that make sense for you guys? Yeah? So it moved from this biological model for change into this extraordinary quantum model for change where instantaneous healings were happening. And because Dr. Joe's a scientist and he's a smart person and he knows that it's one thing to go into a community of people who already have some kind of spiritual understanding. But it's a whole nother thing to try to go against a paradigm of science and allow people to begin to think beyond what they've been trained and taught through school. So Dr. Joe is very, very committed to begin to measure what's happening so that we can make a replicable model for change, so that this isn't something that happens just to a few people sitting on a mountaintop in a cave by themselves meditating. This is happening in cities, in homes across the world. And when I started doing this work with Dr. Joe, I really thought it's so important for people to come to the workshops, you know. They have to come, they've got to be in Dr. Joe's energy, they've got to go through this huge transformation with us all in this group. That's what's changing it. But by the time Dr. Joe got to his third book, You Are the Placebo, you are the placebo. People were buying this book from Amazon, reading it, and changing their diagnosis from leukemia with 6 weeks to live to now no evidence of the disease on tests. So the consciousness of the work, the information is itself evolving, and it's so exciting. Jay mentioned that Dr. Joe and I are now putting something together where we're going to be teaching coaches how to use this model for change. So if you're a facilitator of change at a one-to-one level and you love this model for change and you're diving into it with all of your heart and soul, we'll be able to teach you how to do it. It's very exciting. And it's global, it's not just national, so that's exciting. We've got people in Mexico, the UK and Australia. So what I wanted to do is just give you a little bit of an introduction to this concept of the placebo effect. You guys have all heard of this thing, right? The placebo effect. Dr. Joe wrote this book in 6 weeks. And the reason he wrote it so quickly was because he was furious. He's furious that 30 to 50% of all drug trials are a positive result because of the placebo effect, and no one was studying it. You don't want to know why? You can't make any money from it. You can't make any money from someone taking full responsibility from their own state of health. And so there's very few people or companies who are funding research into this stuff. But there are leaders in this field who are pushing the boundaries and starting to understand that this is one of the most important areas for research in human health. There is a book called The Cure that came out about 6 months ago, written by a beautiful writer called Jo Merchant, and she's a scientific journalist. She's very discerning, she's really, really fascinated by it. And what she's done is really summarised what's happening in the world at the level of placebo research. But she doesn't mention Dr. Joe, and the books came out at a very similar time. And the difference is Dr. Joe's doing this stuff, but he's working with the brain, and he's definitely 100% working with an understanding that consciousness is involved. That it's not just a biological system recalibrating itself. 100% of the time, we have to liberate ourselves from the fact that we're either just the function of our brain activity, or we're a greater sense of mastery. We're a non-local awareness. Okay? So we're going to look at the placebo effect today from 2 points of view, the placebo effect in the brain and the placebo effect in the body. I am going to talk about this for 3 days, so I hope you're all comfortable because we're just going to order some pizza and just hang out here for a while. So every time when I was working one-on-one with people, I really want it to be systemized. I don't want anyone to work on blind faith. And there's a difference between faith and belief that you understand and that you've brought meaning to these beliefs. And we're going to talk about that today. So I want to start by asking each and every one of you to understand that you are a blob of cells, which is made up of a blob of atoms. Very good-looking atoms and cells, but just a blob sitting there. And if I took your brain out of your head, the brain is just the grey, squashy thing inside your skull. If I took that out of your head and put it next to you on the chair, it's not going to do anything. And neither are you, because I just took your brain out. But when that organ is inside part of your working system, it's active. And the activity of the brain is thoughts. We talk about a simple model of the mind being the activity of the brain. So you have the brain in action. So you know your heart has an action to pump blood. Yeah, your liver has an action to detoxify the blood. The brain's activity are these thoughts, these active neurological processes. You have a bunch of thoughts, creates the mind. Happy thought, happy thought, happy thought, active brain, happy state of mind. Resentful thought, resentful thought, resentful thought, resentful state of mind. But who you are as an awareness, who you are as a consciousness, is not the grey squashy thing in your head, and it's not the simple activity of that as the mind. You are a non-local awareness, and the reason we know that is because you can observe your thoughts. You can notice what you're thinking, you can notice the activity of the mind, you can separate yourself out from it, and you can even analyze it. That's the weirdest part. So you can be having these thoughts and emotions, analyze the fact that they're not making you feel very good, and then most extraordinary, you can change them. So you are not you are not your brain, you are not the activity of your brain, you are an extraordinary awareness or a consciousness that has the power and potential to change not only the function of your brain, but when we look at this second point, neuroplasticity, you can even change the structure of your brain. Isn't that amazing? Now, if you didn't know this, don't worry, because science didn't know this until about 20 or 30 years ago. We are living at the most extraordinary time on the planet. And the reason science is making all these new discoveries is because it's now able just to measure new stuff. So they build another machine, they take a new photo, they say, whoops, everything we decided on that last photo is actually different now because we can take a better photo. And so they found out that the brain is not fixed. It's not rigid. It's not permanently wired. That grey squashy thing in your head is extraordinarily plastic, malleable, changeable, easily shaped and moulded. In fact, your brain can change with every thought that you think. Your brain can change with every thought that you think. Notice I said it can. I didn't say it does. And why is that? Because most people don't change the way they think. 95% of the thoughts you have in a 24-hour period are repetitive, habitual thoughts that you've had before. 95% of the emotions you feel on a daily basis are familiar emotions. There they are again, I'm feeling the same way. Here's this hamster wheel. 95% of the actions and the behaviours that you move your physical body through in a daily process are repeated, habitual, learned patterns of behaviour that you do subconsciously or unconsciously. And if you move through your day like that, and you want your brain to change, but you haven't had a new thought or a new emotion, how is that even possible? So we have to embrace this concept of consciousness, and we've got to fall in love with this concept of neuroplasticity. Now, neuroplasticity itself is really cool, but it's not that weird. So remember, I like to hang out where things get weird. So let's look at one of the pieces of research that really blew the lid off this work. And when you start looking at Dr. Joe's work and hanging out with him, he's going to reference it all the time because it's very powerful. They took two groups of people who had never played the piano before, and they wanted to study how you build a skill, how you build a new habit. So they were scanning people's brains, and when they scan your brain, they have a look at the activity of the brain, which shows where it's lighting up, where there's blood flow, where there's electrical activity, where there's increased cell growth. So they scanned their brains before the process and at the end to see if they could measure any change in the structure and the function of the brain. They got these people to do a simple scale for 2 hours a day for 5 days. Pay attention, move your body for 2 hours a day for 5 days, and we're going to see if it changes your brain. At the end, when you read this scientific journal, the abstract is really beautiful because they say they couldn't believe it. Afterwards, the brain had sprouted new connections like dandelions on a front lawn. So organic, so beautiful. The brain had changed because of the way that person was paying attention. Does that make sense for you guys? The brain had physically changed its architecture because these guys were doing something with repetition. Now things get really weird. Ready for it, Pete? They got a second group of people to do the same thing, the same scale for 2 hours a day for 5 days. But don't lift a finger. Close your eyes. See yourself, feel yourself doing it, but don't move. Now, we're not saying visualize it for 5 minutes and your brain will change. We're saying pay attention for the same amount of time that you would, but your brain and your body do not know the difference between real or imagined. Those people's brains on scans afterwards changed almost exactly to the same degree as the people who had physically moved their body. Your brain and your body don't know the difference between something that's happening in your external reality or something you're fabricating internally by thought alone. To the brain and the body, it's the same thing. And this is magic. This is power. This is extraordinary. And you want to fall in love with this principle, because if you have something happening in your internal system and you think it's out of your control, it's not. But what it requires is your attention. And that's the kicker. Most people don't know how to pay attention. Most people have so much awareness going into their mobile phone, into Facebook, into work, into family, into pets, into politics, into social change, everything outside of them, when internally there's turmoil or breakdown or disease. And they expect everything inside to change, but all of their energy and all of their attention is on the environment. When we work with quantum physics and Dr. Joe Dispenza, we say, where you place your attention is where you place your energy. And who here feels and realizes that most of their energy is going to their environment? And if your internal reality begins to break down, do you wonder why, if there's no energy or attention going inwards? So consciousness and neuroplasticity, you want to fall in love with that. I'm pretty much trying to summarize Joe's entire book in like 40 minutes here, so I'm going to move through this stuff pretty quickly. But it really is the starting point. We look at conditioned responses as well. Pavlov's dogs, you guys all know that story, yeah? So the simple conditioning is that there's a stimulus and a response or a reward. So the dogs see the food and they physiologically begin to react, okay? Smell the food or see the food. They begin to salivate, the digestive system begins to turn on. What we do is add a conditioned stimulus plus the actual stimulus. So Pavlov started to ring the bell while he fed them, and the dogs began to salivate and turn their digestive system on. Then after a little while, with repetition, with time, over time with repetition, you remove the actual stimulus and you just have the bell. So the dogs don't even need the food around, but physiologically and biologically, their system's going into overdrive. The curiosity for every single one of us to harness the placebo effect is, are you conditioned environmentally by something you didn't even pay attention to? Or can you condition yourself to every single thought and emotion and powerful belief that you want to choose? The answer is yes. Do you know that almost 70% of all chemotherapy patients get sick on the way to the hospital? Before one drop of chemical has entered their biological system, the nausea sets in. One of my teachers told me a story of a man who had decided that chemotherapy was what he needed to be able to work with the cancer statement that his body was giving him at that time. And he knew that this was one of the most awful, terrible side effect laden chemicals that was on the market. Because everyone had told him, of course, they'll give you that big list of everything terrible that's going to happen to you. And before those drugs went into his body, the nurse put her hand on his arm and she said, I want you to think about this. This is someone's expression of love. The person who developed this drug may have lost someone to cancer and then decided they wanted to help. And so they came through and developed this drug. And I want you to see every molecule in that bag as a love heart going into your body. And this was someone my friend was working with. He had 0 side effects. 0 side effects. People were losing their hair, throwing up, putting on weight. 0 side effects. It's absolutely extraordinary. So if our thoughts can make us sick, perhaps our thoughts can make us well. You can condition yourself. The beliefs and suggestibility are also a very, very powerful thing that we have to begin to tap into. Most people don't even know what their beliefs are. A belief is just a thought that you keep thinking. Again, this is an image from Dr. Joe's book, You Are the Placebo. What we need are a state of being created by your thoughts and feelings, thoughts and feelings, thoughts and feelings over time. Because of neuroplasticity, the brain wires itself with repetition. It's called Hebbian learning. If you want a fun rhyme, neurons that fire together, wire together. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Get some repetition in there. The cool thing is, neurons that don't fire together, don't wire together. So we have this organic nature to the tapestry of your grey matter. You can create something with repetition, but also you can harness the power of pattern interruption. And the less you go down a particular thought pathway, the more it will break down. So you, if you're wanting to change your state of health, must begin to have a look at what you believe to be true. You must begin to have a look at what is possible for you, and you must decide where in that field of statistics you want to lie. Because maybe 50% of all people who live under a telephone tower get cancer, but 50% don't. Maybe 60% of all people with a particular type of cancer die, but 40% don't. And if you believe you're average and you believe you're part of the general public, then you most likely will subconsciously fall into that group. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Every moment you must be careful of who's telling you what from a diagnosis point of view, why they're telling it to you, from their informed point of view, and everyone in your life is doing the best they can with the tools that they have. But your beliefs are the most precious thing you have. Who's heard of Lynn McTaggart? Yeah? She wrote an amazing book called The Field. She's also done a lot on the intention experiment. And she was also a scientific journalist that went around and studied all these scientists who were getting pushed out and ostracized 20 years ago. These people like Dr. Bruce Lipton, Dr. Joe Dispenza, all these people who were studying this kind of stuff. She's amazing. And so when Western science and complementary therapies began to create a huge chasm between them and people started to go against Western science, there's a big divide. And so a lot of people would say, don't do chemotherapy, you know. But Lynn McTaggart says, you know what? The most important thing for every single person to do is to believe in what they choose. Because if you believe that chemotherapy is going to work for you, it will work for you. If you believe you're not going to get any side effects, that's the most important thing. And I have just seen literally a few weeks ago in this retreat we were at, beliefs show themselves in an extraordinary way. We went and did like a vision quest type thing where there's a 4-day dry fast. So you're detoxing from food. You do a 4-day dry fast, no food, no water for 4 days. Science says you should die. Science says you should rehydrate with fluids, you know, because you're going to be so dehydrated after all of that. None of that happened to us. We had people go for 6 days without food and water. But the curiosity was weight. Some people lost so much weight, and when you spoke with them, their greatest fear was that their family was going to know they'd been at some weird retreat, right? And they were going to look skinny. And you just watched them. They were just disappearing in front of our eyes. There was a woman there who was over 150 pounds, and she didn't lose a pound. Not 1 pound in 10 days of no food. I came home and I watched the scales. I went down 0.5 pound a day until I got to 118 pounds, and then I said, that's enough. I stopped weighing myself. I told everyone that my weight had stabilized at 118 pounds. I didn't weigh myself for 5 days, got back on the scales, still 118. Now 119.5, and I still have had almost no food. So very, very weird stuff. That stuff's called pranic living or breatharianism, which is a whole different world that you guys can dive into. But I was just curious about the different experience, even though everyone's physically going through the same process, every single person's individual belief system was playing itself out right before our eyes. The mind is also very, very important when you begin to talk about suggestibility. Because what we talk about is that you have this conscious mind and you also have this subconscious mind. This is the sweet spot. This is the place that holds all our skills, our habits, our emotional reactions, your learned patterns of behavior. This is the storyboard of who you are, your health, your habits, your reality outside of you. So you want this to be filled with extraordinary things, but for most people, all this stuff just got set up from the time that you were young, and you kind of took on your environmental beliefs, your parents' beliefs, your societal beliefs. So the curiosity is, how do we get in through this analytical mind, which forms a barrier between the conscious mind and the subconscious? And there's actually a couple of differences. We call it suggestibility. Some people have a very thin analytical mind. You know those people? You can just say anything to them and they're like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like, it may not be true, but they'll just believe everything they hear. It's a very thin analytical mind. Some people, like myself, who was trained in veterinary science, was very thick analytical mind. I wasn't going to take anything on blind faith. I could see it happening. I had to have it explained, and then I had to learn about it myself, and I had to physically go through that experience. Does that make sense for you guys? Who here thinks I've got a thin analytical mind? He's quite suggestible. Eduardo, very good. That's good to know. You owe me that money too, I think I remember. And who's quite analytical? Who really needs things explained? Who wants to see proof? Right. So it's good to know that about yourself, but what you need to know is whether you have a thin one or a thick one, it's all changeable. You just have to learn how to break through those barriers. Assigning meaning is very, very important, and the last point that I wanted to talk about before moving on to the body is giving people permission. So let me give you another example of some research that they did about what it means to understand something new, to change a belief and how the body follows suit. They had a bunch of cleaning ladies in a large hotel, and they work very, very hard. And they separated them. I think they had 2 separate hotels. And they had these women, and they analysed how much physical activity these women did every day, scrubbing these bathrooms and changing the beds and, doing all the cleaning in the hotel. And they realised that these women were burning way more calories than the recommended daily gym exercise routine to lose weight. But none of the women were losing weight. So they separated them into 2 groups. One of them, poor women, they didn't say anything to them, and they just continued on and didn't lose any weight. The other women, they sat down and they said, listen, did you know that you are actually exercising 2 or 3 times more than most people need to lose weight? And then, of course, they went back and worked with these women several weeks or a month or so later, and many of the women had just lost weight. They realised that there was a meaning to the physical activity that they were doing, and their body followed suit. Isn't that amazing? It's amazing. So we have to be able to choose to bring more meaning into our experience. Being given permission is exactly what Dr. Joe Dispenza did for me. I needed someone to tell me that I could live beyond the genetic destiny that was being played out in my life. And by him going through his accident and transforming himself, he gave me permission to do the same. So if something's happening in your physical body that you want to change, do not stop until you've found proof of someone else that's done it before you, if you need that. Jay and I were talking about that amazing experience of the 4-minute mile, where no one in the world had ever run a mile in under 4 minutes. And finally, after that first person broke that record, within several months, 4 other people had done it, I think, was it? Just within a few months. But it had been decades and decades and decades, and no one had measured anyone doing that. But the moment someone sees it's possible, there's this butterfly effect where everyone starts to do it. So, because we also work with the law of attraction, you'll find whatever you're looking for. If you hear about something that terrifies you, you'll find terrible stuff about them. But if you are looking for answers and cures and miracles, don't stop until you find it. And the universe's biggest gift is the internet. It's extraordinary. And choose where you pay attention. Pay attention to the miracles. Pay attention to the success stories. And so many people are sharing the system of how they've done it, that you can find out if that resonates and go with your intuition. Does that make sense for you guys? Yep. So that's the placebo effect in the brain. We're becoming the powerful creator of our own tapestry of our grey matter. We're using the fact that the brain is plastic and can change and shape itself to represent anything we want. We're also tapping into the conditioning response. Do you know the weirdest thing about the placebo effect is that when they begin to study it, it even works when people know they're getting the placebo. So there's a company in England that's selling placebos, and their capsule's filled with a sugar or something, I don't know, and you get a bottle and you know it's got nothing in it, but you still take it and it still works. Isn't that amazing? It's crazy. I'm going to do it with my mother-in-law. We're going to do an experiment. So I'll be selling those for $3,000 a bottle sometime very soon. The conditioning response, you want to fall in love with your beliefs. Make sure every belief in your body is something you've chosen. It's not something you've taken on outside of yourself. Okay? Begin to have a look at how analytical you are. Begin to see what irritates you when people mention possibility. I heard someone healed from this. That's not possible. Maybe it is. Why don't you find out? Wouldn't it be amazing? People are living on the planet now without eating food. That's crazy amazing. There's a man in India who they put into a hospital and watched him for a week. He doesn't eat and he also doesn't drink. And they scanned his abdomen every day, and his body produced urine in his bladder, and then his body resorbed it because he wasn't drinking, but his body in the deep consciousness level is still recycling all this deep water. Things are getting super weird. Like, I've been going down some really weird rabbit holes. So it's your brain. You get to create it and shape it and literally plant it like a garden. It's also your body. And the mind-body connection is a very real thing. And we talk about it from the point of view of this extraordinary discovery called epigenetics. Who's heard of epigenetics? Good. Dr. Bruce Lipton, another crazy scientist. They're all about this tall, got crazy hair. So epigenetics means above or beyond. Genetics means the gene. Okay? Now the traditional dogma, it's actually called the genetic dogma, was a theory that they put out that meant that we had one gene for one protein in our body. So it was like a very Newtonian linear process. They told us that the cells of our body have a nucleus, and in the nucleus is some chromosomes. When you stretch them out, it goes into DNA. When you stretch that DNA out, little sections of the DNA are called genes, and they code for proteins. Proteins create your state of health. What else would you be doing on a Sunday morning except having an epigenetic lecture? Proteins are responsible for your structure. Proteins are responsible for your function. The quality of your proteins, the amount of your proteins, the fact that they're produced at the right time in the right quantities, it all determines the state of health of every cell of your body, and because you're a blob of cells, it determines the state of your health. Okay? They used to think that this was the brain of the cell. They told us that our DNA was the brain of the cell, and it was as long as it was functioning okay, the cell was functioning okay. This is not true. Another one of those the world is flat, the world is round type moments, and science was furious. They didn't want their dogma turned upside down. Why? Because if every state of health comes from a protein and they could measure genes, then someone's gene wasn't functioning, they could sell the protein instead. They could bottle it and sell it to people and make a bunch of money. They actually tried to trademark genes, like own them. Companies identified genes. You're just like, geez, weird, a lot of swear words I would normally say in Australia. And so what happened was Dr. Bruce Lipton had a bunch of stem cells, so they all had the same information in them, the same genetic information, and he left them overnight. And when he came back in the morning, some of the cells were fat cells in one petri dish, some of the cells were bone cells in another petri dish, and some of the cells were muscle cells in the other petri dish. They'd all been the same cells a little while before. And all of a sudden, they'd gone through what's called differentiation and become specific. The only difference in any of those petri dishes was the environment. He'd placed them in a different chemical environment. And he had an aha moment that resulted in him being ostracized from the scientific community for about a decade. And he realized that the gene is not the brain of the cell. Because what should happen if you take something's brain out? It's not a trick question, by the way. It's going to die, isn't it, Ella? Yeah. If you remove something's brain, it should die immediately. But if you take the nucleus out of the cell, it doesn't die. It just can't repair itself. But it continues to function until everything that it's been able to use and all its stored information in the cytoplasm around has been used up. It can't replicate itself, and it can't continue to make more of what it needs. So it turns out that the nucleus and the DNA is just like a machine warehouse or a storehouse. But it needs to be told what to do. Something has to turn the genes on and off. And that's the extraordinary discovery. You guys are filled with these protein-producing information packets, but something has to tell it what to turn on and what to turn off. The epigenetic model for change shows us that there's a distinct relationship between the cells of your body and the chemical environment that they're in. So the question becomes, what's creating the environment that the cells of your body are in moment to moment to moment? It's a very complicated slide I did that I was never meant to put up a thing. So we have a DNA producing the genes, and the gene expression can either be healthy or the gene expression can be unhealthy, inappropriate or impaired, creating disease and unwellness. Up here, we've got diet. The diet, the food that you eat, changes the cell environment. Does everyone agree? Yeah? Which changes the gene expression. There's a guy called Dr. Dean Ornish who had some pancreatic cancer patients, and he measured 500 genes. And he did nothing, no chemo, no radiotherapy. He just asked them to change their diet and exercise regime for 5 weeks. 500 genes changed their expression just by changing the way you eat and the way you move. 500 genes, some of them up-regulating genes that were going to help with healing and inflammation, down-regulating genes that were going haywire and producing inappropriate proteins, just from diet, changing the cell environment. Lifestyle. You can keep taking yourself into those smoky bars or living around the areas that are going to cause you disease. But the interesting thing from a moment-to-moment perception is the chemicals of emotion that come from your thoughts. Every thought you think creates an emotional reaction, and those emotions can either be positive emotions flooding your body, letting the DNA know that you're healthy and happy and well, or negative emotions that cause contraction and increase the sympathetic system or the stress response. So the way that the genes are responding to the body is through the way you think and feel, whether you're stressed or relaxed, the food that you're eating, and the lifestyle that you choose. But what if we trace everything back? Seems to be like the brain is really connected to whether you're in stress or not. And it seems to me that the brain creates the thoughts, that creates the chemicals of emotion that create the environment. And your brain is involved with the thoughts and emotions that drive your choices and behaviors into the lifestyle choices you make. And your brain is also involved with your habits and your choices for food. But are you your brain? No. You're an awareness that's using your brain. Does that make sense to you guys? You are 100% responsible for the gene expression and information in your body. You have the power to change your state of health at any moment. And one of my favorite quotes, what lies behind you and what lies in front of you pales in comparison to what lies inside of you. When you dive into the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, we talk about the biological model for change, where we begin to, thought by thought, rewire the brain and emotion by emotion change the chemical constitution of your body and begin to change the way the genes express themselves and heal disease processes. The quantum model for change are those people I was telling you about that have a disease process and make such a shift in one meditation or just a few meditations that they open their eyes and they're in a whole new timeline. They come out of a timeline, a quantum. We talk about simultaneous timelines stacked one on top of each other. And in this one, they're in disease. And they go into meditation and they let go of the resentment, or they let go of the emotions that they've been addicted to that was creating such disease in their body. And the moment they finally forgive themselves or free themselves from that emotional addiction, they wake up into a new version of themselves. They open their eyes and their body has acquiesce to that new vibrational frequency of themselves, and they walk out of that meditation without that disease process. And I'm talking about people who have genetic processes going on. My friend Susie was diagnosed with Hashimoto's syndrome. She's in the story in here. She's called Candace, but she loves everyone to know that it's Susie. And she no longer has Hashimoto's syndrome, and it's, according to Western science, a genetic inherited disease. Anything is possible, you guys. But you just have to learn how to pay attention. So one of the amazing things about Dr. Joe is he's systemized, and he will give you meditations to begin with. He explains exactly why you're going to be doing it and how to do it, and then he'll supply you with the opportunity to go and see him, to do it in person, Go see him, go see him, go see him. It's one of the most extraordinary experiences you'll have. We've been going for years and years and years now. And, you know, you can, and with that repetition and just diving into the work. And that's it. Are there any questions before we do a quick meditation to finish? Yes, Navi. How are you? Yeah, we got, they're recording this, so we'd ask you to speak into the microphone. Is this thing on?
Can
Joe,
you hear it?
tap, tap, tap.
Can you hear it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So I appreciate so much all the information you shared and what I've learned myself over these last 5 years. But I felt myself really contract at a point where you're at the end that I'd love for you to speak to, and it was where what I was receiving as information was that we have the ability to change, you know, our thoughts and all of that. But where I felt contraction was from experiencing cancer myself.
Yeah.
If I get it again, then it's my fault because I didn't change what I believed. And
Beautiful
there's
point.
a part in there that I don't, that's not the perspective I hold.
Yeah.
And so I'd love for you to share your perspective on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for pointing that out. And it's a very important point to address. And in my work, working one-on-one with people as well, there's that greater perspective. So there is I believe anyway, there is a life path that we all have, you know, and a lot of people will develop disease processes to go through their learnings, you know, to remind them that there's attention required internally. But I've also worked with people who have passed away, who their process of withdrawing their consciousness from this body was the process of cancer. And so it's a really important point for you to make, that we have the potential, but it's not always a healing that's the right thing. Thank you for pointing that out. And when you work in the quantum world, you work in the world of and the world of both. So you want to be able to hold the potential that you can heal, but also let go of any attachment. That's the most important thing. When you work in the quantum world, you realize that maybe you do want to heal, but you don't have to stay here either, kind of thing, because there is no death and consciousness is beyond the body, sort of thing. So it's a fine line between, because my mum died, you know, we had spoken a lot about these types of healings when there were only a few books around on juice fasting and things at that time, but it was her choice, you know, not to do it. And there has to be a starting point. Someone, like you've got to be curious about what path you want to take and how you can integrate all that stuff, you know. But I do believe it's possible, you know. And if it comes back, there's more learning, you know. And then it's a dance. There certainly isn't. Talking about this stuff can be painful for a lot of people because there's almost always someone in the audience who's lost someone recently to cancer, and it makes people upset, or you get weighed down with responsibility. And Dr. Bruce Lipton, when he first began to present his stuff, would stand in front of the world and talk about epigenetics and say, you have the power to change everything. And the first thing people talk about is childhood disease. They didn't choose it, you know. What about that? How dare you say that they're responsible for the disease in them? And there are some, they think about 5% of these diseases they call genetic are actually genetic. So there's actually a miscommunication there's actually a fault in the actual triggering and sequencing of the genes, but everything else, all the other diseases, are just inappropriate interactions of the genes turning on and off. But Dr. Bruce Lipton stood there, and people were throwing things at him because they were furious. They said, how dare you make everyone responsible for that? It's a huge weight on people's shoulders. And he said, you're not responsible until you're aware. Because when you didn't know, you didn't know, you know. But once you become aware, then you are responsible, you know. And that was what he was saying. And the only responsibility is, how do I feel? What do I want to do? You know? And there are people who live, just because someone's told you there's a cancer in your body doesn't mean it's going to go down any particular process. Some people can live for a long time and not die of that cancer in their body. Does that make sense? It's a really precious, sensitive thing. I'm getting the time frame thing. It is. It's a sensitive place. But if people can start looking at it themselves, yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. It's
No
so wonderful to come to these things and just feel so filled up every week.
A comment I have is the impression about how you can take all of what you said today and bring it to another quantum level, incorporating the aspects of the soul and the dictates there. And I know that's all connected too, and it kind of speaks to what this woman was just talking about. But I want to get back to the protein piece, because your charts were great, and then that last chart, it was like if the protein is the building block of the cell, where did that fit into that last visual model? Do you understand what I'm asking?
I do, but I think we're probably going to have to finish.
Okay.
I'm here on Tuesday nights running meditations, and I'm also have a 2.5-day workshop in August. So we do Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, where we go into the details of all of that. But you can come and chat to me after if you like. Yeah. I'll be up here having a chat. Yeah. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do some giving, and we'll do a short gratitude meditation at the end. Yes, Ella?
I just realized that what happened to me yesterday was the topic of your discussion today. Before I went to pick up my 5-year-old and 3-year-old great-grandchildren to go play with them, I have some knee issues, so I said I better take some Advil because I don't want to be in pain. I want to be able to play with them. Went to Faribault, hung out with them, had a great time, no knee pain. I get home, those pills are still on the counter. I never took them.
Yes!
So
Amazing.
how do I do that all the time without the pills?
But that's the weird thing, is that you can take fake pills and just keep taking them, but you're not actually putting the chemical in your body, You could try that out. I've got a box you can have for $50. Thanks. Come and speak to me after.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, thank you, Justine.
That's crazy. Okay. Beautiful. Good work. Thanks for coming. Please just close your eyes. Take your awareness into the center of your chest and feel that area. If you want to use a color, you can think of a green light in the center of your chest. And as you inhale, allow that green light to expand. And as you exhale, just let that light soften. Inhaling into the heart. Exhaling. Allow that green light to flood from the heart center through the entire body. Liquid light flooding down the arms. Liquid light flooding down the abdomen into the toes. Light flowing up into the head. And become aware of your whole body at once, please. Whole body awareness, filled with light. These are the cells of your body. Feel that light as unconditional love. Feel like the parent to the cells, these children of yours. Can you love them? They're just waiting for you to come home. Whole body awareness. Unconditional love and gratitude. Taking that gratitude to the rest of the people in this room, to this beautiful building. Feeling thankful for our opportunity to gather here today. And also thanking yourself for taking the time to learn, to be present, and to be curious. Feel that gratitude. Beautiful. Thank you so much, everybody. You can open your eyes. Yay! Happy Sunday!